Well, welcome everybody to the online program for the alumni of the Sunshine Coast Health Center up here in Powell River, British Columbia. And I wanted to talk this month about this idea of change in recovery. One of the fellows mentioned the other day about he had an addictive personality, and he had to get over this addictive personality if he were to get recovery. And those of you who have been here know that I'm not a big fan of any kind of concept of addictive personality, because personality is who you are as a human being. Okay, it's your values, your motives, your beliefs, just how you react to situations, what you want out of things. It's really who you are, but it's even beyond who you are. It's beyond identity. It's really at the core of you. And this idea of an addictive personality and this concept that so I have to change, it's almost like I have to change who I am as a human being in order to get recovery. Okay, anyway, we'll talk about some different ideas around what is this change that people go through in recovery, and is it a personality change? Now, if you've ever read the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, you know that Dr. William Silkworth, has a little chapter in there, and he warns everybody that recovery is going to take an entire psychic change. And a little later on, talking about what this change means. I mean, these values, it talks about emotions and behaviors and belief systems and things that used to be so important in active addiction in recovery, less so. It's like there is this dramatic change. And if you remember that research study that I talked about with William Miller and Janet C. DeBacca, and this idea of people who've had this transformational change, or they call it a quantum change, right, from inactive addiction and then having this change, and then in recovery, and the values in active addiction, or before the change happened actually. It wasn't just addicts they studied, but there were a lot of addicts in there. But they, things like for males, if you remember, wealth was number one, and achievement, and adventure, and fun, and getting respect from others were all huge before the change. And then the values after the change were more like spirituality. In fact, wealth dropped from number 1 to number 50, right to the bottom of the list. And the changes were more like people were more self-centered in active addiction, and then more other-centered in recovery. And you think about that, and that it almost sounds like this is a big personality change, right? And then we talked about that other research study that William White did, if you remember, where he took 7 case studies of people who had had this big change in their recovery, or actually led to their recovery, and looking at that and making the comment that abstinence was a byproduct of this change. Like, so this very dramatic change that happened to people in recovery. And so some people think that, well, maybe this, like who they are as a person, has to change. So this is an interesting thing, because I always wondered whether or not that's true, right? Whether or not people do have to change who they are. Anyway, as I mentioned, we'll study some things. So the first one we'll talk about is very famous theory in psychology. Sorry to bring in some psychology, but it's called trait theory. Anyway, there's 2 famous people, Costa and McCrae, and they're very big proponents of this thing called trait theory. And what that basically means is each of us has a bunch of traits. And some of us are extroverted, some introverted, some outgoing or shy. Oh, some of us are very agreeable, some of us are conscientious, others aren't very agreeable, others of us aren't very conscious. Anyway, you lump all these things in. They're called the Big Five. So each of us has some sort of combination of the Big Five, and that's who we are as a person. And Costa and McCrae say, if you actually study people over time, you'll see, actually, it's true, they don't really change. And so according to these trait ideas, If they looked at someone in recovery, they would say, no, of course he hasn't changed as a human being. He's still the same person, still the same personality. Now, he may have changed things like his behaviors. Obviously, he's not getting drunk all the time. And he may have changed things like, maybe the motivations have changed from, getting drunk every day to, well, maybe we'll try to get a life. I mean, all those things may have changed. But that's not really that doesn't alter the person, who this particular person is. So that's one example of people who would say, yes, there's a change in recovery, but on the other hand, it's not the personality that's changing. The personality is still the personality, right? And it's not an addictive personality, by the way. It's just a personality. And so next week we'll talk about probably the totally opposite idea, where another psychologist says, oh yes, there's no question that the addict in recovery has changed. Anyway, see you next week with the next one.